Good morning. Can you hear me now? Okay, this is not boot camp, by the way. My name is David Walcher. I'm a member of the SALT committee, and I'm here to give you a few announcements before I introduce the speaker that you are all looking forward to hear, and you will all enjoy. I know you will. Okay, my announcements. Please silence your cell phones. Nothing worse than hearing the Battle Hymn of the Republic during somebody speaking. If you haven't filled out one of those white address cards, that's how we get in touch with you to let you know what's going on. Please do that. Thank you in advance for filling out your speaker evaluations. This helps us know what topics you would like to hear, and also nice to know how we did. Okay, now about our speaker. We are very pleased to have Mrs. Sally Sudo with us today. She brings to us a first-hand experience of what it was like to be in an internment camp during World War II. And fortunately, she is still with us. She's looking hale and hearty. I'm very, very pretty this morning, I might add. Okay, if you please help me welcome Mrs. Sudo.
Good morning, and thank you, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce two guests here. I represent the Twin Cities chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League. This is the oldest and largest Asian civil rights organization in the United States. And with me from our organization is Dr. Karen Lucas over here, and she was a practicing physician in Apple Valley. Maybe some of you were her patients, I don't know. And then I have Steve Ozona with me. He is a commercial photographer that has won awards for his photography and in documentary filmmaking. And he has never filmed me giving this presentation, so he asked if he could come and do that today. Preserve it for history. You know, I'm not going to be around that much longer. And there are very few in my generation that really are still able to tell this story firsthand. I want to start out by telling you about my title for the talk. Actually, concentration camp is the correct word because it means a guarded compound where ethnic or religious minorities are confined for political reasons. Now, people kind of hate for us to use that word because it conjures up memories of concentration camps in Germany. Well, those were really extermination camps, and our camps were definitely not run the same way those were. And also, to call it an internment camp, like our introducer did, is really, if I want to get technical, is not a correct term. Because an internment camp is one that is run by the Department of Justice, and only immigrants can be placed in an internment camp. 2/3 of us that were sent to this American concentration camp were American citizens because we were born here, and we should have had every right that every one of you have. But really, the Constitution was ignored during that time. Of course, our whole thing that changed the trajectory of our lives was the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And I'm not sure if any of you were alive when that happened, but you'll remember it happened on a Sunday afternoon. In our community, there was much talk about, I wonder what's going to happen to us. You know, my parents were immigrants. My father had come here actually in 1899, and my father, after he went back to Japan and got married, brought his new bride over, and so my mother had been here since 1917. So they had been living here as legal immigrants for many decades. And yet, in America, if you were an Asian, you weren't even allowed to apply for naturalization. That did not happen until 1952. So there they were living as legal immigrants, but really not as well protected as they should have been by our Constitution. This is a map that shows you where the Japanese population was at that time in 1940. And you'll notice here that, of course, the concentration is mainly on the West Coast, with Washington close to 15,000, here in Oregon, 4,000, California, a large number, over 90,000, close to 94,000 there. Here in the state of Minnesota, there's only 51 people of Japanese ancestry. So we were a very little known nationality here in your state. In October and November of 1941, a special representative of the State Department, Curtis B. Munson, under Roosevelt's order, carried out an intelligence gathering investigation on the loyalty of the Japanese Americans. You know, as tensions were growing between Japan and America, they really were worried about that large concentration of Japanese on the West Coast. And so Munson's report was submitted to the White House on November 7th, 1941, a good month before Pearl Harbor. And he concluded there is a remarkable, even extraordinary degree of loyalty amongst this generally suspect ethnic group. The report was ignored and kept secret by our government. So really, even the FBI did not approve of the idea of rounding all of us up and putting us in these camps. But I think Roosevelt was under much political pressure, especially from the delegation of those western states. They wanted the Japanese out of their state. This is my family growing up in Seattle, Washington. We lived in this area called Nihon Machi, which means Japantown. And if you've ever been to Seattle, it's that area that's now called the International District. So very kind of walking distance to Pike Marketplace, to the ferry, things like that. And I come from a very large family. I'm one of 10 children. I'm next to the youngest. So at the time of Pearl Harbor, I had just turned 6, 2 days before Pearl Harbor. So my experience of living in these concentration camps lasted for over 3 years, exactly 1,264 days of my childhood was spent in a prison camp. Of course, there was much racial prejudice and discrimination against not only all other Asians, but Japanese as well. And so those tensions really grew as after Pearl Harbor. When we were put in these camps, the government placed the number of those that were incarcerated at somewhere between 110,000 to 120,000. And it wasn't until a Buddhist priest in California, just 2 or 3 years ago, got grant money to actually research how many people really were imprisoned in these camps. And he came up with a figure of 125,284. And what he did with that information is he created this book. It's, in Japanese, it's called an ideicho. Ideicho means a memorial list. He gathered all the names, placed them in this book. This book weighs 25 pounds and is over 1,000 pages long, and every name of any person that was in one of these camps is recorded in that book. And this is a picture of my nephew, who took the time to go out to the Japanese Museum in Los Angeles, where they have the book on display. And what each family is allowed to do is put what we in Japanese called a hanko. A hanko is like a rubber ink stamp, and it's used for any legal papers in Japan. Instead of signing your signature like you would in America, they have to stamp it with their family stamp. And so at the museum, they created a special stamp, and you were allowed then to go through the book and find your family members that were in a camp and stamp their name. kind of just validating the fact that they were actually there. And not only were there 125,000 plus in these camps, but they were actually in 75 different prison camps. Now, within 24 to 48 hours of Pearl Harbor, the FBI rounded up 1,294 Issei. Issei are my parents' generation, the immigrants. And they were rounded up if they were like prominent businessmen, editors of Japanese language newspapers, or a teacher in a Japanese language school, but the vast majority of them were Buddhist and Shinto priests. And they were taken away, often their family not knowing where they were sent. And then they were put in these internment camps at places like Missoula, Montana, Crystal City, Texas, Santa Fe, New Mexico. There were about a dozen of those internment camps where these people were placed, really without being accused of any crime, just the fact that they were prominent business people and leaders in our community, and they were taken off. And then the FBI came to all our homes, and they took away what they considered contraband. To them, contraband were things like, if you had a shortwave radio, they took away your cameras, your binoculars, if you had any kind of firearms. People in our community were so concerned that maybe they would be found with something that could be considered threatening, that people like my parents, they had these big empty oil drums in the backyard, and they started burning letters that they had gotten from their relatives in Japan, or books that they had that were written in the Japanese language, or even phonograph records with Japanese music on it, just trying to destroy anything that might make the FBI suspicious. 19th of 1942, President Roosevelt signs this executive order 9066. And what the order does is he authorizes the military is going to be put in charge of the different zones that's being created by this executive order, and it's going to be up to the military to decide who could live there and who could not live there. And so this is how the United States was divided into 4 military zones. And of course, living in Seattle, we fell under the Western Defense Command. And in charge of that command was this Lieutenant General John DeWitt. And this is the only zone then where the people of Japanese ancestry were forcibly removed from their homes. There were Japanese living in other parts of the country, but very few. I want to say that number would have been under 10,000, like New York City or Chicago, places like that. And for them, mostly it amounted to them being under house arrest until they could, have somebody testify that they were loyal Americans. So, like the 51 people that were here in Minnesota, they mostly worked for the Northern Pacific Railroad, and they went back and forth between Seattle and Minnesota. And up to, I think Duluth was one of their final stops. So there was a group that lived in Duluth. There were a few that lived in the Twin Cities, but that was the only thing that happened to them, was to be placed under house arrest temporarily until their name could be cleared. Now, of course, I was in kindergarten at that time, going to this school called Bailey Gatzer. Every morning, we were very loyal. We pledged allegiance to the flag. And you know how they say liberty and justice for all at the end? That wasn't so true for us. This is a picture of a mother, a Caucasian mother, at the bedside of her half-Japanese child. And it's from the San Francisco Chronicle. And if you were as little as 1/16 part Japanese, this removal law applied to you. So this is her half Japanese son. He finds out he's going to have to be taken away from the family and put in a prison camp. He tries to commit suicide. We often wondered, how did the government even find all of us to round us up? And it wasn't until, I think it was the early 2020s, that this article came out in the New York Times that showed that really it was against the law, but what they did was they went through the census records of 1940. Because at that time, the way the census was taken, you had to identify yourself by nationality. And so by that, they could pick out, who the Japanese were and where they were living. For us, I could go through a phone book and probably pick out 95% of the Japanese names, because every other letter is a vowel, and usually it ends in a vowel. So it's pretty easy for me to pick them out. But this is how they found where the people lived and were able to round them up. This is the second grade classroom at Bailey Gatzert where our family went. And this is before the removal took place, and now this is the classroom after the removal. And the other remaining Asians you see were probably Chinese or Korean or Filipino, and they were actually issued buttons that said, I am Chinese, I am Korean, or whatever, so that they wore these buttons to prove that, no, they didn't have to, they didn't need to be rounded up. It was kind of their own protection. This is the area of Seattle that I lived in. It was a very thriving business area, many shops and businesses owned by the Japanese people. And then when we get removed, this is that same section, all boarded up. And of course, the majority of these people lost their property. Now, even Dr. Seuss got into the act by really putting out some very racist cartoons. This one shows how we're all lining up to get our block of TNT so that we can commit sabotage, for bomb the bridge, whatever. But it's important for you to know that in all of World War II, not a single person of Japanese ancestry living in the United States or the territories of Hawaii or Alaska was ever convicted of any kind of acts of sabotage or espionage. There were actually 18 cases that went to trial. Of those 18, 11 were convicted, but they were all Caucasians. Now, this is the Lieutenant General I told you was in charge of our area. And look at his racist statement. The Japanese race is an enemy race. You needn't worry about the Italians at all, except in certain cases. Also the same for the Germans, except in individual cases. But you must worry about the Japanese all the time until he's wiped off the face of the earth, is the part that doesn't show. Very prejudicial attitude. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, then a member of the family had to go to what they called a civil control station. These were often like a community hall kind of building, or it could have been a church. And then you were issued a family number. That's what this tag represents. This is not my family number, it's just a replica of the family number. Our family number was 11872. And you had to wear them on your person, like I am, or put it on every piece of luggage when it came time to be moved. And of course, we had to do the usual things of getting vaccinations, and anybody 14 years and older was fingerprinted. The first group in our area that left were those that lived on Bainbridge Island. You know that you can take the ferry from Seattle, it's about an hour away. And the reason they were removed so quickly, in fact, they were only given 10 to 14 days to take care of all of their personal business and property. Can you imagine if you were told you have to leave and you've only got 2 weeks and you're going to be out of there? you have to leave almost everything behind because everybody knows you're going to be moved. And so you leave and it's free for the taking. Nobody's going to offer you anything for the things that you have. This is how so much property was also lost. And so they were then taken first to Seattle and put aboard trains, and they were sent to a camp called Manzanar, which was in California. That was one of the first prison camps that existed to start taking people in. All the others they were busy getting them built. And so while they were building them, here we're told we're such a danger that we have to be moved. They took those of us who lived in Seattle and put us aboard buses and sent us to the Puyallup, Washington State Fairgrounds, which is kind of southeast of Seattle, about an hour by bus. And this is where we're kept over the summer months. In these temporary buildings that are really just flat on the ground, and you know how much rain there is in that area. So over the summer, the boards on the floor would shrink and all that mud would come seeping into your room. Besides this, they used the animal stalls and the horse stables to house close to 8,000 or 9,000 people over the summer. Now, this map shows you where the 10 camps then were built to take care of those 125,000 of us that were going to be sent away. And you see the two here in California, Tule Lake and Manzanar. Our family went here to this one in Minidoka in Idaho. There's Hart Mountain in Wyoming. That is spelled wrong. It should be the word Hart, H-E-A-R-T. Topaz in Utah, Grenada in Colorado, although our people called it Amachi. I think Grenada was the closest city. And then there's two here in Arizona, Poston and Gila River. So this is then where these are all very dry desert-like areas where nobody had ever lived before, and really the living conditions were pretty harsh. So after spending the summer at that fairgrounds, we get put on trains again. We're told to ride with the window shades down, and there's an armed guard in the front of every car, and off we go to this prison camp. When we get on the other end, we are boarded on these army trucks, or in some cases buses, and then we get to the actual prison site itself. And you can see it's just rows and rows of tar-papered barracks. Really not completely finished with their construction. And our camp consisted of 44 blocks like this of tar-papered barracks. And here's the map of the camp, and this is where we lived here on block 14. And you'll notice that there's a natural canal that runs along the southern border. And up here in the north, you see these are all vegetable gardens. Because if you know anything about the Japanese, they're farmers. And so they used the water from the canal to irrigate the fields up here. And by the second summer, our food really vastly improved because of all those homegrown vegetables. And this is then how a typical block was laid out with the common buildings in the middle. This would be the mess hall, and then this one that's like the letter H, it would be the sanitation building, women and men, you know, on either side. And then in the middle of that was where the laundry facilities were, and then barracks on either side. All these camps were constructed the same way. In fact, I knew a high school teacher that when she was teaching World War II, she would show pictures of the American camps like we were in and the ones in Germany and ask the kids, which is it? Is this America? Is this Germany? They couldn't tell the difference because they're built the same. And this is myself in this picture of our block 14. there I am in the red circle, and although our cameras were taken away, there were a few Japanese that were photographers that would sneak at least their lens into camp, and then they'd build themselves, you know, a camera box. And so there were a few that were able to take pictures, but for the most part, the government hired very well-known photographers to document this whole chapter. It was people like Ansel Adams, Dorothea Lange, you know, very well-known photographers that came into the camps and took pictures. And this is how bare the interior of these barracks were. Like I told you, they're really just partially finished because they have no insulation, no drywall, no ceilings, and each barrack was divided into 6 rooms, so that they called them apartments, and the larger ones were on the ends, and then as you got towards the middle, they got a little smaller. But because we were such a large family, we were given 2 rooms in one of the barrack buildings. Now, they're not connecting rooms. You have to go out the front door of one and then the front door of the other to go back and forth. And I remember asking one of my older siblings, how did we divide up? Who stayed in what room? And they told me that the older ones stayed in one room, and then our parents and the 4 younger children stayed in the other. But the older ones, because there were, you know, my sisters and my brothers, they hung bed sheets between the sections so that they could have a little privacy. My first memory is filling up these bags that were going to be our mattresses to sleep on. And anything that you see in the way of any kind of improvements, I'm talking about even a little thing like a shelf. These are things that the inmates had to do for themselves. They would scrounge for scrap lumber left over from the construction and build these things. And then, of course, all of our meals were taken in the mess hall, and they planned the budget for our meals at 43 cents a day to feed us, and that's because they said that was based on what was used to feed the military, their K rations or whatever they're given. So, and then anybody who had done, you know, any kind of work before they were placed in the camp were asked to continue that work in the camp if they were able to. So if you had been a cook, then, you know, you worked as a cook in the mess hall. And the pay scale was, if you were a professional person, like a medical doctor or a dentist or a teacher, you got paid $19 a month. If you were a skilled worker, you got paid $16 a month. And then an unskilled worker got paid $12 a month. Now, if you're going to be in a prison camp for over 3 years, earning that kind of meager salary, you are not going to be able to keep up with your property taxes back home, let alone a mortgage payment. And this is how the vast majority of the Japanese people lost everything they owned. And the sanitation conditions were the worst. I didn't care, I'm only 6 years old, but imagine being a teenager like my sister, having to shower with the person next to you is showering. You can touch them, you're so close. Some of the girls actually used to wear their bathing suits in the shower. And the toilets, even worse, because they're open toilets. No stalls, no doors, you know, having to do your business in front of everybody. My sister was one of them that was 13 when she went into the camp and going on 17 when she left. She was the one in our family that ended up with a nervous breakdown afterwards. So, you know, there are psychological scars, not necessarily physical ones, but for her, her psychiatrist said he was sure the precipitating incident was those years in camp that she just felt humiliated every day. And there were like thousands of school-age children in these camps. And the government had done nothing about providing for our education. And so it was the men of the camp that designated, okay, we're going to have this block is going to be designated as elementary school, and we'll use these barracks for classrooms and so on. And then that way they had an elementary school on either end of our camp, and then a junior high school and a high school towards the middle of the camp. And then the men had to build the furniture for elementary age children to sit in. My experience was pretty much like this, where we sat on the floor and we used picnic-style benches to do our desk work, or if the teacher was going to read to us, we could sit on the benches. But very inadequate education, as you can imagine. Okay, this is a picture of my sister in her 4th grade class, and I'm not sure why it's only girls in this picture, but because it was a co-ed school. And the high school students changing classes, you can imagine they felt that they were pretty much getting a substandard education. It was very common for the teacher to be the only one with the textbook. And then she would read to you, and it was up to you as a student to just take notes. You know, but how are you supposed to do a science class without a proper lab, or chemistry, or things like that? And Eleanor Roosevelt actually came to visit 2 of the camps, because there had been stories in the newspaper about how we were being coddled in the camps. And we were getting better food than the ordinary person living, you know, during the war. That we must be getting more rations than the rest of the population, which of course was not true at all. And so she came to investigate for herself, and she brought along with her Clarence Pickett, who was the executive secretary for the American Friends Service Committee, which is the Quaker group. And his interest was, they were really concerned for that college-age group that was stuck in these prison camps, because they had been pulled out of their universities or college to be sent to this camp. And here they were wasting away their lives. So he got the Quaker group to organize a student relocation program. And they had committees in 10 or 12 major cities, the Twin Cities being one of them. And that committee then was ordered to try to find colleges or universities or other schools of higher learning like Dunwoody Institute or St. Mary's Hospital in Rochester. Find out who's willing to accept a student out of these camps, help them with some scholarship money, help them find a place to live, help them with a part-time job if they needed to. And in that way, over 4,000 college-age students were able to leave the camps for various schools in the Midwest or out east. And in Minnesota, you should be proud that there were 22 colleges that took in these students. And Minnesota accepted a little over 400 of them. They were all private colleges like McAllister, Hamlin, St. Olaf, Carleton, Gustavus Adolphus, and then the Dunwoody Institute here, and then St. Mary's Hospital in Rochester took in those that wanted to become a nurse. And that really was a very successful program, and one that the students that got the opportunity to do that we're so grateful for, that even to this day, their descendants carry on with a scholarship fund that helps refugees that come to our country from war-torn countries. And they distribute money every year and kind of passing it on. Now my vivid memories are of the dust storm because it was a very dry desert-like area. We learned to carry a scarf around with us all the time so we could put it over our nose and mouth if ever a dust storm kicked up. And heaven forbid that you should be eating in the mess hall when the dust storm hit, because then your food would be covered with sand, and that was it. That was your meal for the day. And they did try to keep life as normal as possible for the kids. They did things like have Christmas parties or Easter egg hunts. As far as where did they get presents for the Christmas parties, it was church groups like yours. When there was an article in the paper, when a little boy was overheard asking his mom when they first went to the camp, how is Santa ever going to find us? And that tore at people's heartstrings, and so gifts came pouring in from church groups in the Midwest and the East Coast. Now, I'm sure there were not enough presents for all the camps and all the children to get gifts, because as I said, I was age 6, going 9.5 by the time I left. I never got a present the whole time I was in the camp. Neither did anyone else that I knew of in our camp. So they probably restricted it so that whatever camp they sent it to, every child in that camp would be covered. And then that creek that I showed you, they would let you swim in it in the summer, and then actually ice skate if you had skates with you. Because in Idaho, it got as cold as 20 below in the winter, and as hot as 110 in the summer. Now, I showed you how bare those barrack buildings were. Can you imagine being in a building like that at 20 below? We learned to put as many layers of clothes on as we could. And then there was a pot-bellied stove in the middle of every room, but you were limited to 1 bucket of coal a day. So you had to use it very carefully. And if you had any standing water in your room, it was cold enough for that water to freeze. Okay. And to keep the young people occupied, the high school students formed sports teams, and they petitioned the government for equipment. And so they had baseball, football, and basketball were the ones I was aware of. And they always then invited a school from the neighboring towns to come into our camp to play the games. And for some reason, our team was always at the top of the league. I think it was the nervousness of those others coming into a prison camp to play that benefited our team. But anyway, it turned out well for them. And for my mother, her hardest and time-consuming job was having to do the laundry by hand. Imagine a family of 10 children, all those sheets and linens that you're washing. Other than that, it was really, she considered it almost like a little mini vacation, because for the first time in her life, she doesn't have to cook, she doesn't have much housework to do, and she had time for hobbies. So she took things like ikebana, the Japanese style of flower arranging, or she studied calligraphy, how to do that brush writing, and pattern making. Those are the things that she did in camp. And whoever knew how to do a skill, would just form a class and teach it. And my sister Marion, the oldest girl in our family, was married, and she had her first child in camp. And he was born in March of 1945. I said to her, I just can't imagine how you took a brand new baby back to that terrible barrack room, no refrigerator, no running water. I just don't know how she managed. Now, my brother Joe was in the top row, 4th from the left, actually volunteered to serve with the U.S. military while we were in these prison camps. And he then, because of his Japanese language ability, was assigned to the military intelligence service. And they had a school here at Fort Snelling. And so that's how he ended up being here in Fort Snelling. And after his training here, he went on to serve in the Philippines, and then he went in to occupy Japan as one of the first groups that went into occupy Japan. And of course the war ends, and many towns have this sentiment, we don't want them coming back to our town anymore. So now we're in a quandary, where are we going to move? We've lost everything. There's nothing left for us in Seattle. And so because of the experience of my brother Joe, he said, why don't you think about coming to Minnesota? I found the people here very friendly, and I think you could make a good life here. So that's how I ended up in Minnesota on August 18th, 1945. That was, 3 days after the Japan surrendered. And the first ones that came out were my brother Fred, my sister Amy, and my brother Tom. Now, while Joe was here, he actually helped Fred get out of the camp by getting him enrolled at Dunwoody Institute. And then my sister Amy, helped her get out of the camp because they needed secretaries at the language school. And so she had good secretarial skills, so she came out here and did that. And then my brother Tom, the reason they sent for him was all those 3 years we were in the camps, unbeknownst to my parents, he had refused to go to school. I think that was his way of protesting. He would go off every morning like we were going to school. He'd stay away all day in another block just playing cards with all these other delinquents. and then when it was the right time, he'd come back home. So my parents had no idea he wasn't in school until finally in the 3rd year, one of the teachers came to our family and said, why isn't Tom in school? And that was the first my parents heard about it. Very upset, because for the Japanese, education is a very important thing. And so when my brother Joe was here in the military, he found a family that lived near Lake Calhoun that was willing to take in my brother as a houseboy, so he'd have a place to live and maybe a little spending money, and then he could finish his education at West High School, which is what he did. And, he did turn out okay, because after he served in the military during the Korean War, he went back to college at Augsburg, got his degree in mathematics, and he became a math teacher at Roosevelt High School here in town, and he did that for 30 years. So if you had a Mr. Ono for a math teacher at Roosevelt, that's my brother. Well, somebody over there. Okay. Then this is then where we lived in Minneapolis. My brother Fred found this house for us at 5218 40th Avenue South. It used to be the homestead for whatever farm was there at that time. And the only reason we were able to buy it was because we bought it from the man who built the house. I think that area was under one of these racial covenants where you were not supposed to sell to a family of color, because we were the only Japanese living in that neighborhood for miles around. Yeah. But when we got it, my brothers especially worked really hard to get it all fixed up, because it had been vacant for over 2 years. And my friends told me that the grass had grown so tall around that house, and they had to walk by it when they went to Minnehaha Elementary School, that they thought it was a haunted house. And so I want to close by telling you about this pin I'm wearing. Where is it? Is it covered up? Right here. Okay. This pin has 2 characters that read Shin-nen. Shin-nen means be confident, have faith, believe. And this was a pin that I received from a relative of my father at a special ceremony, which was held in 2002 in Olympia, Washington. Now, My father's cousin's name was Takuji Yamashita. And Takuji Yamashita was an immigrant to America just like my father. He had come 6 years earlier than my father, and I'm sure that he was influential in talking my father to come. But he did a smart thing. He enrolled in a Seattle public school. So he got a high school education in Seattle, and that made him really quite fluent in English. And then he got accepted to the University of Washington, where he then went through law school, and he got his degree in law. He was with the first graduating class of the University of Washington's School of Law. This was in 1902. But because he was not a citizen, they would not let him practice law. So he became a strawberry farmer, and he had hung his law degree on the living room wall, very proudly displayed it. And then in 2002, 100 years later, there was a reporter that decided he wanted to investigate whatever happened to that first graduating class. And he came across my father's cousin. And he was interested to learn, well, this, here he had passed the bar exam and everything, but not allowed to practice law. So he told that story to the Bar Association of the state of Washington, and they decided to hold a ceremony posthumously for my father's cousin. And many of his relatives came from Japan. This is him on the left, and his relatives from Japan that came to the ceremony, because Takuji, after Pearl Harbor, he was one of those men that got rounded up by the FBI within 48 hours. For months, his family had no idea where he was. He was in a prison camp at Fort Lincoln in Bismarck, North Dakota. And what was his crime? They found dynamite on his property when they were, investigating everybody. Well, he's a farmer. He got land that was filled with tree stumps. He needed that dynamite to clear his land. But of course, he came under suspicion, so he gets picked up and put in this other prison away from his family during World War II. And then after the war is over, of course, he has lost his strawberry farm. He's lost everything. He has to start over again. He's in his 60s by then. And really, he kind of gave up on the American dream. And so his children were grown by then, and he and his wife decided to go and live in Japan again. So they went back to Japan to finish out the rest of their life. But his only surviving daughter at that time came out to Minneapolis with our family, and she lived in Minneapolis until she got married and then went back to live in the Seattle area. But to me, this is a reminder of, you have to keep the faith. You have to believe that things are going to turn out all right, and just be confident that you're doing the right thing. Now, I wanted to save time for questions. So if you have one, please raise your hand, and you're going to have to help me by speaking very loudly. Is there a mic? Karen, do you think you could walk, or is that plugged in? Does it unplug? No.
This
Okay.
one's simple.
Maybe if you
Just
talk loud.
what was that address in South Minneapolis? The
I'm sorry,
address of
what?
the house in South Minneapolis.
What about
The address of your house in South Minneapolis.
40th
How
Avenue.
did?
What was the address of your house?
Oh, address of my house in South Minneapolis, 5218 40th Avenue South. The house is still there. 2 summers ago, by the way, my brother bought it for $6,000. 2 summers ago, I saw the lady that was the owner in the yard doing yard work, and there was a for sale sign up. And I said, oh, I'm curious, how much are you selling this house for? And she said, well, it's already sold. And we sold it for $360,000.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah, okay. Over there? Help me hear the question.
Were those, your brother you mentioned were American names? Did they have also Japanese names?
Did my siblings have Japanese names? Actually, all of our legal names are all Japanese. And we were dubbed with these English names, usually when we started school. Like, my real name is Shigeo, but it was my kindergarten teacher that said, I think we'll call you Sally. And so ever since then, I've been Sally, you know. But that's, and then also if they joined the military, like my brother in the MIS, his Japanese name was Eiichi, and they called him Joe. So, you know, they just did that, yeah. Any other? Yes.
Now, you mentioned when you were in the camp about what your mother did, and we know that you, as a young person, went to school. What did your father do? What was he allowed to do or required to do?
You're asking me what did my father do?
Yes.
All of his life, he worked in the restaurant industry. So he was mainly a cook, and he did that when we lived in Seattle. It was very easy for him because of the area that we lived in. He mainly worked in Japanese restaurants. You know, they're very popular now, but back then, not so much. But in our segregated neighborhood, they were very common. And then when we came out to Minnesota, he was actually already 63 years old. And you have to think of yourself as 63, having to start your life all over again. He took a job at the Curtis Hotel. Remember, there used to be one on downtown? And he worked in the salad division, making salads. But even then, after a year, he said, the English is just too much for me. And you know, he was constantly being given orders in English, that he quit that job. And he actually worked well into his 70s as a janitor at what was then St. Mary's Hospital on Riverside Avenue. And really, the effects of having been in these camps affect even, I want to say, my descendants today. You know, the fact that my parents, they lost everything. I mean, it almost makes me cry to think that when I got married, my mother said to me, you know, there's really nothing I have that I can give you. So what she did was she gave me all of her books of SNH and gold bond stamps that she had saved, you know, from the time I became engaged, because then she knew that I could trade them in for something that I needed to furnish my apartment. But, you know, to think, I mean, I'm sure most of you got really nice gifts from your parents when you got married, but this is all that my parents had to give me. Yeah. Yes.
Were marriages arranged for a long time, or did you have some choices?
When I got married,
Well,
the arranged marriage idea, I think, pretty much ended with my parents' generation. From then on, well, especially for those that were born in America, there was nothing was an arranged marriage. There was all romance. Yeah.
Clothing, was that made in the camp, or was that something you had to purchase, or how did that happen?
The clothing, did they have to make the clothes?
Oh, what did we do for clothing? Actually, the government gave us $3 each for clothing expenses. I think that was every month. And so we used to pull that money and order from the Montgomery Ward or Sears Roebuck catalogs, and whoever needed something the most would get to have, you know, that new winter coat or whatever we could get with that money. So me myself, because I was the youngest of 6 girls, I got all those hand-me-downs. Right. But the older ones, you know, they had to replace their clothing. My biggest issue was the shoes. To this day, my feet are a little deformed because I had to wear shoes that were not properly fitted for too many years. Wow. Yeah. Ooh, lots of questions over here.
I have 2 quick questions. One, where did the skates come from that they would skate on?
Where did what come from?
The skates. The skates.
Winter skates.
Ice skates.
Ice skate.
Ice skates. Well, if people had them, they just brought them with them to the camps, which kind of surprises me because we were only allowed to bring 2 suitcases. So in our case, it wasn't toys, it was clothes that we brought. And the only thing in the way of a game that I was allowed to bring was a deck of cards, which was a pretty good one because you could play so many different games with cards. Yeah. Somebody else? Yes?
Most people in Japan, as I understand it, are Buddhist. You, excuse me, I was so pleased to see so many Christian colleges accepting people. Did you practice Buddhism in the camp?
Were you a Buddhist in the camp? Because most of the camp residents probably.
Okay, she's asking, was I a Buddhist in the camp? I would say the majority of the Japanese population were Buddhist, but in my case, our family, from the time we were little, sent us to the closest church, which was the Seattle Japanese Baptist Church. So that's where I was going to Sunday school, and my siblings went, and that minister, I remember his name to this day, Emery Andrews, was the minister of that church, and when we got sent off to the camps, he actually moved his family to Twin Falls, Idaho,
Oh my God.
because he had lost his congregation, and he wanted to be near where they were. And he was very helpful to this Japanese, congregation, even living in Twin Falls and us being about 25 miles away in that camp. In the beginning, almost every weekend, he used to drive the church bus back and forth between Seattle and Twin Falls because the family would say, "Oh, Reverend, I left my card table and 4 chairs in storage in the basement of your church. Can you bring those to me the next time you come back?" And so he was constantly driving back and forth, doing errands like that for his people. Unfortunately, his wife found it very difficult to live in Twin Falls, and they actually ended up getting divorced.
So we're Dakota and Scott County people. I wonder how many here remember the Savage internment camp just in the west side of Savage. When we moved here in 1960, we still could see the piers from those houses out there. And
Okay.
I'm always surprised at how many people believe Savage was an internment camp. Savage was not an internment camp. My father.
Can you use the mic, please?
Yeah.
Yes.
Here, speaking to my mic.
My father was drafted in June of 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. There were 5,000 Japanese American second generation Nisei soldiers in the U.S. Army before Pearl Harbor. And some of them were kicked out of the Army, but like my dad, they were assigned to labor details, and my dad was sent to Michigan shoveling coal into furnaces. But a lot of these men had some Japanese language background. And so when the military needed Japanese language intelligence linguists, this is where they sought those linguists. So my dad was brought to Savage, Minnesota. He was in the first class. In Savage, Minnesota, there were 200 soldiers. 160 of the 200 were Nisei, or Japanese American. They studied intensive military Japanese. And they all served in the South Pacific and Alaska and China, Burma. The military intelligence service, Japanese linguists, and the intelligence trained people accompanied U.S. military units in every campaign in the Pacific, from the Solomon Islands to Guadalcanal to the Philippines, Iwo Jima. That's what Savage was. It was a school for military language specialists who served with the U.S. Army while their families were imprisoned.
Oh, wow.
I think it's time to stop. Okay.